Then I turned myself to consider wisdom and madness and folly. Then I saw that wisdom excels folly as light excels darkness. The wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. Yet I myself perceive that the same event happens to them all. The Kohelet. I just have one more question for you, Merritt. Knowing what you know now about how hard it was to come back from that time within the inner circle, would you do it again? Merritt almost says no. But he catches himself and looks off into the distance. He can still feel the allure of not having to think for himself. And that is both disappointing and telling. Merritt Worthington had spent years training for deep cover assignments, but nothing had prepared him for this one. His mission was not to infiltrate a criminal syndicate or dismantle an international espionage ring. No, his task was far more insidious. He was sent to become effectively stupid, perhaps irrevocably so, for the sake of science. The assignment came from Weld Darner, a behavioral scientist obsessed with a theory that had troubled him for decades. His core belief was that all human beings were inherently born with access to the highest of intelligence, what folks in ancient times called the Godhead. What he wanted to know was what got in the way of us accessing it on a global scale in order to create societies where most of humanity could thrive. His working theory was that it was an issue of nurture suppressing nature. From his research, he gathered that means justification was the culprit. In other words, he believed that if early in life someone was taught directly or indirectly that the ends justify the means, that very same Godhead-level intelligence would develop a distorted reverse bias wherein their intelligence will be used to impede any thoughts that would facilitate building relational bonds with people that they believe will not serve them in arriving at their desired ends. Almost like RoboCop with its prime directive. What was most confusing about this use of intelligence is that they actually have to deny what they know is true and affirm what they know to be untrue in order to maintain a semblance of structural integrity and intentionality for anything they do. They could be likened to someone who was so committed to failing a 100-question test with a score of 2 that they study what it would take to get a 100, then hypnotize themselves to get 98 answers wrong. Then when they are criticized for only getting 2 answers correct, they respond with saying, "I am so intelligent that I got 98 answers wrong on purpose just so I can get the only 2 right that I wanted to get right." It is all part of the plan. It wasn't ignorance in the traditional sense. It is like willful anti-intelligence, a rigorous discipline of wrongness in service to an imagined victory. It was, in short, a kind of genius in failure. Only they didn't really study at all. They just got a score of 2 because that is all they know. But they say that they were aiming for a 2 with such confidence that it even confuses the people who are aiming for a 100% who, because they are so concerned with avoiding getting an answer wrong, are rarely ever able to speak with such confidence. This was a real problem. It was both sides of the Dunning-Kruger effect, DKE, taking hold of the very potential of humanity. You see, many people are familiar with the overconfidence of the incompetent aspect of DKE. But many are not familiar with the self-doubt of the competent aspect of this phenomenon. The irony of the Dunning-Kruger effect is that both sides feed into one another. The incompetent dominate conversations because of their confidence. The competent hesitate, which can make them seem less certain, even when they're right. And as a result, bad ideas too often spread faster than good ones, because confidence is frequently mistaken for competence. Hence, America. And this is the problem Darner aimed to solve. Unfortunately, any effort that Darner made to recruit overconfident people to participate in his research utterly failed. It was next to impossible to get them to consider that they know less than they thought they did without subjecting them to a devastation-level event, which was unethical. Therefore, he had to find someone intelligent enough to know that they still could learn more and yet confident enough in their expertise to speak up. But the kicker was that for this mission, the person had to also be disciplined enough to ignore their intelligence. Because any sign that they might be thinking for themselves, such as asking clarifying questions, might blow their cover for this very important project. Wordsworth, the leader of a rising political movement, was the perfect test case. By every objective measure, he was an uninspired, directionless man with the intellectual agility of a waterlogged sponge. And yet, he was on the verge of gaining power in the upcoming state election. His followers, equally uninspired but fervently devoted, seemed to operate under an unshakable belief: if him said it, it must be true. Merritt's job was to embed himself into MT's inner circle, not to stop him, but to become like them. If scientists could figure out what it took to make a rational, thinking human surrender to nonsense, they might understand how to reverse the process. To get the data they needed, the experiment required total immersion with no contact with thinking people for the entire time he was undercover. And that wasn't just limited to conversations. This meant that for 2 years, Merritt was forbidden from reading, engaging in critical thinking, or interacting with anyone outside of MT's influence. His only source of information was the H3S, she said, television network, a perpetual fog machine of misdirection and contradiction so dense that even Merritt, who once prided himself on his analytical skills, began to let go of the habit of trying to discern if the information going into his head was factual or not. As one might imagine, at first, the mental acrobatics of denying obvious truths were exhausting. But eventually, he learned the golden rule of MT's world: stop trying. And by simply doing nothing to exercise his executive brain function, he realized that his life seemed way simpler than it did when he read, thought, had conversations with people from a variety of backgrounds, and concerned himself with the general well-being of all humanity. Even he had to admit that trying to be a truly caring human being and feeling responsible for living up to his professed values even when no one else was looking was a relentless pursuit with not a lot of reward. In so many ways, being in the inner circle of M.T. Wordsworth almost felt like living on permanent vacation. Imagine almost never having to think for yourself or take any responsibility for your actions. Merritt could see himself getting used to this. If MT was asked a complex question, whether about tax policy or the weather, the answer was whatever MT felt like saying in that moment. No calculations, no consistency, no need for coherence. And miraculously, that answer was right. Because rightness wasn't about accuracy, it was about confidence. And the more people who nodded along, the more right it became. There was only one answer to every question: what does MT have to say about it? Imagine the simplicity. Someone asks you a math equation such as 1937-495-3970x873743/8374296 plus 826846224x2846234 and you don't even have to pull out your calculator because everyone knows that if you pull it out and it doesn't match whatever M pulls out of the ether, you will be wrong. So stop trying. Of course, it took a little getting used to. Ignoring facts, rationale, and your own experience doesn't come easy. But, also, it is a lot to keep track of and takes effort to retain. Why do that when you can just take no responsibility for anything and just look at one person for all of your answers? Plus, you get all of the perks of knowing things without actually having to know anything. Some people would call that genius. And only the people who would call it genius made it into the MT inner circle. Before he took this assignment, Merritt never thought it was possible for him to lose his hard-won abilities to discern right from wrong, assess people's core motivations, be a master negotiator and more. But, at the time of extraction, it was pretty clear that he had developed a type of Stockholm Syndrome. He truly believed that he had cracked the code on M.T. Wordsworth and felt that Darner's threat assessments were highly exaggerated. And sadly, Merritt believed that he was being objective. He had no idea that in his time undercover, he had developed certain biases as a result of his amygdala being hijacked by MT's erratic though confident behavior. But the reality was that he was so far gone that he had come to believe that MT had orchestrated Merritt's whole mission from behind the scenes and had actually tricked Darner into choosing Merritt specifically for his genius. That's how lost he had become. And this terrified Darner. Rather than figure out a way to reverse the negative nurture effect, had he discovered a way to accelerate and strengthen it? After all, according to his theory, most people lost their access to the Godhead-level intelligence when they were still too young for the prefrontal cortex to have developed enough to help them discern whether a situation called for an amygdala-driven reaction or not. But Merritt was in his 30s with decades of experience that helped him handle cognitive dissonance and other mental calorie-burning activities. And yet, he was in borderline walking coma still answering questions with, what wouldn't they say about this? Then finally, after months of intervention, something broke through. As Darner predicted, M.T. Wordsworth had won the election. He was now the governor of Missibamasas, the megastate that emerged after Mississippi, Alabama, and Arkansas went bankrupt after deciding to protest any funds coming into their states from other states that supported pro-consciousness ideologies. And though Merritt had come to believe that MT was onto something with his mama, Make America Missibamasas Again movement, when the new administration first act was to make an attempt to annex Louisiana and Tennessee, Merritt started to question where his confidence in MT had come from. This annexing decision reminded him of something, of someone. It reminded him of his mama, of when he wasn't able to protect her from his father who he had once worshipped even though he suffered at his hands. That was it. Just as he had convinced himself that his father's abuse was his way of loving him and teaching him to be a man, Merritt had projected benevolence onto MT. But when his mama tried to defend her son only to end up on the receiving end of his father's powerful hands, Merritt forced himself to get strong enough to step in to try to stop his dad. He wasn't able to do it then. But he could now. Relearning the skills of independent thought was painful. His old intelligence had atrophied like an unused muscle, and worst of all, he had to confront the things he'd said and done under MT's influence. Just as a former addict does when they think of the things they did under the influence of drugs or how repentant Nazis did after World War II, Merritt shuddered at the thought of how utterly convinced he'd become that MT had a plan. He knew that he didn't. And in some kind of way that made him almost feel sorry for MT. That's when all of a sudden Merritt realized why he surrendered to this clearly broken man. It was because Merritt and so many others who followed MT knew what it was like to be broken by the people they wanted to trust more than anyone, their parents. Though he was not able to call it up once he had been triggered, Merritt had trauma bonded to MT. They all had. His personal battle to re-intellectualize was more about his internal struggle to break free from the trauma bond with MT than any ideological agreement. And just as he once wanted his own father's approval, perhaps what made it so hard for him to leave wasn't just the comfort of simplicity, but a deeper emotional entanglement where, at some level, he wanted MT's approval, even though he intellectually knew MT as a fraud. At last, after months of deprogramming, Merritt was ready to submit his final report. The question posed to him was simple: if given enough intervention, do you believe MT's followers could do better? Could they ever be trusted with leadership in the future after a re-intellectualization program such as the one you participated in? He took a deep breath, then wrote. As much as it pains me to deny the capacities of my fellow humans, I have come to the conclusion that they cannot do better. It is what it is. I have had the privilege of being around some truly unintelligent and uninspiring people. Many of them know they are not thinkers. But they believe that if they can acquire the symbols of success, they can erase the ignorance that haunts them. When they are in charge of anything, they feel like thieves on the run, barking orders, gaslighting subordinates, and scrambling to distract from their own incompetence. Their only strategy is momentum. If you move fast enough, no one will stop to ask where you're going. And if they do, you mock them until they stop asking. Their confidence is unshakable, not because they have answers, but because they refuse to acknowledge questions. They have mastered the delusion that a broken clock is right twice a day. They stumble through life, and when luck hands them a moment of success, they retroactively declare it part of their master plan. And even the thoughtful, hesitant people, so terrified of being wrong, look at their reckless certainty and ask, could they actually know something I don't? They don't. After 2 years of being inside, I can confirm, there is no method to the madness. The only thing you can do is stop trying to make sense of nonsense. The only way to counteract their ignorance is to trust your own intelligence as much as they trust their ignorance. Because if we don't, we're all screwed. The real trap isn't what we consider other people's stupidity, but the psychological dependency that fuels it. And that's not just a problem for MT's followers or even MT himself, it's a systemic issue that extends to his opposition as well. The more they focus on defeating MT, the more they validate his role in the system. The only way out is not to win against him but to render him irrelevant by rebuilding a culture where people don't need an authoritarian figure to give them certainty. He put down his pen and stared at the words. And yet, something gnawed at him. The truth wasn't just about MT and his followers. No, the real horror was that they hadn't created this system, they had been summoned into existence by it. The people who positioned themselves as MT's opposition were not truly opposing him, they were fueling him. Their very righteousness, their fear of making mistakes, their desperate need to be seen as good and thoughtful and fair, it was all part of the cycle. The culture had created an opening for someone like MT because it had abandoned the ability to tolerate imperfection. People were so terrified of saying the wrong thing, doing the wrong thing, thinking the wrong thing, that when MT arrived and declared that nothing mattered except sheer, blind confidence, he became an escape hatch. His followers didn't have to be right, they just had to be certain. And the people who fought against him? They had become just as predictable, just as reactive, just as controlled by fear. The real tragedy wasn't that people had become ignoramuses. It was that they had become dependent. MT and his opposition were locked in a grotesque dance, each justifying the other's existence. The only way out wasn't to defeat MT. It was to break free of the entire framework, where every mistake was treated as failure rather than learning, where fear dictated action instead of curiosity, where being right was more important than being in relationship with one another. Merritt added one last line to his report. If we want to change the world, we have to stop punishing people for being wrong. Otherwise, we'll just keep creating the need for an MT Wordsworth. He closed the file. The real work, he realized, was only just beginning. The findings of this experiment are beyond what I could have ever hoped for or imagined. When I set out to send someone in to infiltrate MT Wordsworth's inner circle, I never in 1,000 years would have imagined that someone as intelligent and disciplined as Merritt Worthington would have had such a difficult extraction. My blessedly incorrect assumption was that although they were not permitted to exercise it, the agent would have retained their executive functioning throughout the term of the immersion. Just as a person could retain their first language while learning a new language as I did while attending an immersion language school for Mandarin, I surmised that Merritt would fully be capable of communicating his experience upon his return in the fashion that I was accustomed to. After all, it was not like he was a prisoner in the conventional sense. In fact, according to him, there were many enjoyable and comfortable experiences in the inner circle. But what this experiment has taught me is that many of us, to include those of us trying to resist authoritarians like MT, actually have a part of ourselves imprisoned within our own minds, desperate for a way out. And the function of someone like MT in our society is to give as a kind of escape. This is fascinating and will require a new type of research and internal type. Although I maintain that MT is an authoritarian and should not be trusted with decision-making authority that will impact millions if not billions of people, I also acknowledge that he is just as much a victim of the system as the people he is harming. And so our approach to remedying this cannot simply be, get him and his followers out of power. It has to be a strategy that aims to distribute power to as many people as possible. We have to encourage innovation and experimentation. And we must by all means embrace what Buckminster Fuller called, mystique, that awareness that all progress has come through vision, trial, error, and revision. Finally, we must embrace multidimensional intelligence. While I still do believe that we humans naturally have access to Godhead-level intelligence, I realize now that it can only be accessed through conscious interrelating and knowing that just as hurt people, healed people heal people. And so after submitting this preliminary report, I will take a sabbatical to do some healing of my own so that I can liberate the imprisoned part of myself that, fueled by rage, set out on a multi-year plan to stop him, but only for him to rise to power anyway. Upon my return, hopefully healed, I will begin a new experiment that asks, what will it take to create a solution that can dissolve these authoritarian movements with love rather than trying to defeat them with fear? But, when I say love, I do not mean some smushy, ineffective chocolate and flowers television love. I mean a love that flows like water. It is time for us to realize that being loving isn't just all sunshine and rainbows. It is about liberation. Water washes. But it also erodes, dissolves, and when necessary breaks whatever gets in the way of flow. And it doesn't do it with malicious intent. It does it naturally and effortlessly by just being what it is. It can do nothing else. Knowing what I know now, I can do nothing else.
So some of y'all probably heard about the Smithsonian being under review, let's say, by the current administration because they disagree on the version of history that this institution is putting forth, right? So they're challenging it. So what you don't know, because you probably don't know me, is for about 3 weeks in March, I served as a volunteer docent for the Smithsonian exhibit. I'm not going to say which one because I don't want people saying stuff. And anyway, some people already know. At any rate, and I kept thinking to myself, how long before people start saying something about the Smithsonian? So last week, a little bit more than a week ago, I was in DC and I went to the Smithsonian African American History Museum, as well as the U.S. Holocaust Memorial and the MLK Memorial. And while there, I saw a very interesting phenomenon, and that was a lot of MAGA hats. And I kept thinking to myself, how is it that these folks are coming to these free museums and rocking these hats with no sense of irony? And I kept trying to think to myself, what is not going through their head that if it were going through their head, they would take off this hat? But since they didn't take off the hat, I'm assuming nothing was going through their head. But something was going through my head, which was stress. And I did feel that I wanted to interview them very intently to get some understanding. But because I was there with my family, I chose not to do it. And instead, I ended up making this allegory. And with this allegory, I basically imagined what it would take for someone to go undercover into a MAGA type situation and what they would have to forget in order to be cool with what was going down. And then what would it take for them to snap out of whatever isn't going on in some of the folks' heads in order to get back to, I would say, re-intellectualization. At any rate, it was a very interesting exercise to make this allegory, and I want to invite you to check it out. There's not a lot of things that I create that I say, oh, I hope this goes viral. Pretty much nothing. I usually write kind of like a lot of artists do. I create to create because I just have to create. Then I put it out there and then it does what it does, or it doesn't do what it doesn't do, which is generally the case. But with this particular piece, I do want to encourage you to check it out. It's on my Substack. Link to the Substack will be with this video. But also, if you're not viewing this video on a platform that enables links, then I will put it in the bio, or you can just go to Substack and then type in at Pedro, Pedro, Senorina, Senhorinha, Silva, Silva, and it'll take you to it. And I'll also have that tag at the end of this video. So if you want to check it out, you can. So at any rate, if you've been trying to make sense out of the nonsense, this will help you at least make a little bit of sense out of the nonsense before you give up. So hopefully this connects with you, brings some value to your experience. And if you get something out of it, in this particular instance, I would encourage you to share it with other people so that we can have deeper conversations about what's going on and what's not going on. Peace.